Wyoming, 1882. The table had been built for six. Not bought, built. Ezekiel Marsh had made it himself in the winter of 1861, the year before he married Catherine, from a single plank of white oak he'd had hauled up from Cheyenne on the back of a wagon. He'd sanded it by hand, 3 nights running, until the surface was smooth enough to eat off without a cloth. He'd jointed the legs with the careful precision of a man who intended the thing to outlast him, which it had, because Catherine was gone, and 2 of the children were gone, and the other 3 were scattered across a territory too large for Sunday visits, and the table was still here. 6 chairs. He'd made those too, in the same winter, the same oak, the same precision. They still sat around the table in the positions they'd always sat, 2 on each long side, 1 at each end. His chair at the head, Catherine's at the foot, which he hadn't moved in 8 years and didn't intend to. The 4 in the middle were empty most days. Ezekiel was 52 years old and ran the Marsh Ranch alone, which was 320 acres of Wyoming grassland north of Bitter Creek, with a herd of 80 cattle and 2 ranch hands, brothers named Cal and Roy who were competent and reliable, and went home to their own cabin at the edge of the property at the end of each day, leaving Ezekiel to the house and the table and the particular silence of 6 chairs with 1 person in them. He had been advertising for a cook since March, not a housekeeper. He could manage the house well enough, which was to say badly but functionally. A cook specifically, because he had not eaten a proper meal since his daughter Agnes had left in February to marry a man in Laramie, and because Cal and Roy had begun to look at him with the quiet concern of men who have noticed that their employer is surviving on coffee and cold biscuits, and have decided this is not sustainable. He'd had 3 candidates. The first had taken 1 look at the kitchen and asked about the nearest town. The second had lasted 4 days before deciding Wyoming winters were not for her. The third had been excellent and had received a better offer from a hotel in Cheyenne and had taken it without apology, which Ezekiel respected even as it left him back where he'd started. He was not, by October, optimistic. Her name was Nora Vasquez, and she came from Santa Fe, by way of Denver, by way of a series of circumstances she summarized in her letter of application as various and not entirely voluntary, which was the most honest job application Ezekiel had ever received, and the reason he'd written back within the week. She arrived on a Thursday in October on the afternoon stage, which Ezekiel met in Bitter Creek because Cal had offered, and Ezekiel had said no, without examining why. She stepped down from the stage with a large carpet bag and a trunk that was considerably heavier than it looked, and the composed, assessing expression of someone who has arrived in a number of places and has learned to take stock quickly. She was 31 years old. Dark auburn curls cut short and pinned at the back of her head, with the practicality of someone who has decided hair is not worth managing during work. Dark brown eyes that moved across the stage depot and the street, and Ezekiel himself with the rapid, accurate attention of someone doing a quick inventory. Esmer skin, a fine scar above her right eyebrow that she'd had long enough to have stopped thinking about it. A brick-red frontier dress that had been washed many times and was still good. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said. He moved to take the trunk. She let him, which he noted in her favor. Not helplessness, just the practical sense of someone who knows when to accept assistance with heavy objects. "The letter said 320 acres, she said, as they walked to the wagon. "Yes, and 80 cattle, 83, as of last week." She nodded. "And the kitchen. The letter said it was well equipped." He paused fractionally. "It has everything necessary," he said. She looked at him sideways with those dark eyes. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She almost smiled. He found himself noting this, the way you note something unexpected, not dramatically, just with the awareness that it had occurred. They drove the 8 miles to the ranch in the October afternoon, the Wyoming grassland flat and gold around them, and the mountains blue in the distance, and she asked practical questions about the work schedule, the provisioning arrangements, the preferences of the ranch hands regarding meals. He answered all of them directly, and she received the answers with the same focused attention she'd given everything else. When the house came into view, she looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's large," she said. "I built it for more people than are currently in it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the house. The statement sat between them with more weight than he'd intended, and he was aware of that weight, and was not sure what to do about it. "How many are currently in it?" she said. "One," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "That explains the cook advertisement." "Among other things," he said. The kitchen was not well equipped. This was apparent within the first 20 minutes of her inspection, which she conducted with the thoroughness of someone who has worked in enough kitchens to know exactly what questions to ask of one. She opened every cabinet. She tested the stove damper. She examined the pantry with the focused attention of an archaeologist, and emerged with an expression that was carefully neutral. "I'll need to go to Bitter Creek tomorrow," she said. "For what?" She produced a list. It was already written, which meant she'd been making it during the inspection, which meant she'd known before she finished the inspection what she'd find. He looked at the list. It was specific and practical, and not excessive. "Cal goes into town on Fridays," he said. "I'll go with him," she said. She looked at the pantry again. "For tonight, I can manage something from what's here. It won't be elaborate." "Nothing here is elaborate," he said. She looked at him, the dark eyes direct. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "when did you last eat a proper meal?" He thought about it honestly. "February," he said. "My daughter Agnes made a roast before she left for Laramie." Something moved across her face. Not pity. He would have noticed pity. Something more practical than that. The expression of a person who has identified a problem and is already thinking about the solution. "Sit down," she said. "It'll take an hour." He sat. He was not accustomed to being told to sit in his own kitchen, and he found, somewhat to his surprise, that he didn't mind it. What she produced in an hour from a pantry that had produced nothing but cold biscuits for 8 months was a beef stew with dried herbs and root vegetables and bread that she made from scratch while the stew cooked, timed so that both were ready together. She set it on the table without ceremony and sat at the side, not at the foot where Catherine's chair was, which he noticed. And he ate. It was the best meal he'd had since February, and he said so. "That's a low standard," she said. She was eating her own portion with the focused efficiency of someone who doesn't make a performance of meals. "I'll do better once I have the right provisions." "It doesn't need to be better," he said. "It needs to be this." She looked at him across the table. "You've been eating cold biscuits for 8 months," she said. "You've lost perspective." "Possibly," he said. She looked at the table, at the 6 chairs, the 4 empty ones, the chair at the foot that had nothing on it and hadn't been moved. "Your letter said there were children," she said. 3. "Agnes in Laramie," he said. "Thomas in Denver, Margaret in Casper." He looked at his bowl. "They visit at Christmas when the weather allows." "And the other chairs?" she said. She said it carefully, the way she said things she wasn't sure of the ground beneath. "My wife Catherine," he said. 8 years ago, fever." She was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not performed, just received." "The chair at the foot," she said. "You kept it." "Yes." She looked at it, then back at her bowl. She didn't say anything else about it, which he appreciated more than he would have expected. After supper, she washed the dishes without being asked. He dried them without being asked. They did it side by side at the basin, with the easy division of people who have both done this enough times to know how it goes, and neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm and the Wyoming night was pressing at the windows, and it was, Ezekiel thought, the least alone he had felt in 8 months. He went to bed and lay looking at the ceiling and thought about a woman who'd looked at an empty chair and asked the right question and then not pushed it, and found he was going to sleep more easily than he had in some time. She went to Bitter Creek with Cal on Friday and came back with provisions and opinions. The opinions were about the pantry layout, which she reorganized with a system she explained to him once, and that he understood immediately, which seemed to surprise her. The provisions transformed the kitchen inside of a week. into something that smelled different than it had, the particular smell of a kitchen that is being used properly rather than endured. Cal and Roy ate lunch at the ranch house now. This had not been the arrangement under the previous cook or under the cold biscuit regime, but Nora had made it clear on the second day that she cooked for the number of people on the property, and the ranch hands were on the property, and that was the end of the discussion. Cal and Roy had appeared at noon, with the expressions of men who couldn't quite believe their luck, and had been appearing every day since. She was quiet at meals. Not unfriendly, she answered questions directly and asked her own, and had already extracted from Cal the full history of the ranch's cattle management and from Roy the state of the winter feed situation, both pieces of information being more current than anything Ezekiel had told her. But she was economical with words in a way he recognized, having always been economical with them himself. She doesn't talk to fill space, he thought one evening, and then, more carefully, most people do. He mentioned this to her on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks in, when they were in the kitchen after supper and she was making a list for the following week's provisions and he was at the table with the accounts. "You don't talk unless you have something to say," he said. She looked up from her list. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's unusual." She looked back at her list. "I worked in a hotel kitchen for 2 years," she said. 12 people in one room all day. I learned the value of quiet. "Before that?" he said. She was still for a moment. Not evasive, he'd learned to read the difference, just deciding how much to tell. "My husband's family had a restaurant in Santa Fe," she said. "I cooked there for 6 years. Had," he said. "He died 4 years ago," she said. "The restaurant went to his brother." A pause, which was legal and also the end of Santa Fe for me. He looked at his accounts. "So, Denver," he said. "A hotel there, and then this." She put down her pen. "The various and not entirely voluntary circumstances." "You wrote that in your application," he said. "I know. I almost took it out." She looked at the list. "I left it in because I thought if it put you off, we wouldn't suit anyway." He looked at her. "It didn't put me off," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Friends, before we go further, I need to stop and ask you something. These stories travel to places I never imagined when I started writing them. Someone listening in Australia right now, someone in Ireland, someone in Canada or Germany or Brazil. Where in the world are you tonight? Leave your country in the comments. Every single one of you is someone I am grateful for. Now let's go back to Ezekiel's table, because November is coming, and something is about to be said that can't be unsaid. November came with the full weight of a Wyoming winter that has decided to arrive early and make itself at home. The first serious snow came on a Tuesday, 6 inches by morning, and still coming at noon. Ezekiel spent the day in the barn and pasture with Cal and Roy, managing the cattle, and came in after dark so frosted over that Nora looked at him from the stove with the expression she sometimes wore. Not quite concern, the more practical version of it, the look that was already calculating what needed doing. "Sit," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You're frozen," she said. "Sit." He sat. She put coffee in front of him and went back to the stove, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the cold leaving him by degrees and thought about a woman who had been in this house for 6 weeks and had learned without being told which battles were worth having. "The north pasture fence," she said. "Holding," he said. "Cal reinforced it in October." "The cattle?" "All in the near pasture. We'll check again in the morning." She nodded. She set a plate in front of him, something substantial, the kind of meal you make for a man who has been outside in Wyoming in November all day. He ate without speaking. She sat at the table with tea and her provisioning ledger, working through numbers with the focused attention she gave her work. At some point, he became aware that the snow had stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked. The lamp threw a warm circle on the table. "This table," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things do in warmth, after cold. She looked up. "I built it for 6. he said. He looked at the empty chairs. In 1861, before the children came, before I knew how many there'd be. I just built it for 6 because it felt right. He was quiet for a moment. I've been sitting at it alone for 8 months, and before that, with Agnes, and before that, he stopped. It was built for more than this. She was looking at him with those dark brown eyes, direct and steady, and giving nothing away but receiving everything. I know, she said quietly. I know you know, he said. You asked about the chairs the first night. I did. She looked at the chair at the foot, Catherine's chair. You didn't move it. No. You're not going to, she said. It wasn't a question. No, he said. But, he stopped. He looked at the table and then at the woman across it, and thought about 6 weeks of meals and quiet evenings, and a kitchen that smelled right, and a person who didn't talk to fill space. But there are 4 empty chairs in the middle, he said, and 1 person at the side. The kitchen was very quiet. She put down her pen. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to approach and is deciding how to receive it now that it has. Mr. Marsh, she said carefully. Ezekiel, he said. It's been 6 weeks. Something moved in her face. Ezekiel, she said, are you telling me something? I'm telling you something, he said, if you want to hear it. She was quiet for a long moment. The snow outside had stopped, and the Wyoming night was perfectly still, and the lamp burned between them on the white oak table that had been built for 6. I came here for a job, she said. I know. I didn't come here looking for. She paused. I know that too, he said. Neither did I. He looked at his hands on the table. The same hands that had built this table 40 years ago, that had smoothed the white oak 3 nights running until it was right. But here we are. She looked at the table, then at the chair at the foot that hadn't moved in 8 years, then at him. Catherine's chair, she said. Catherine is not coming back, he said. I know that. I've known it for 8 years. Keeping the chair isn't, he paused, finding the words for something he'd never had to say before. It's not waiting, it's remembering. Those are different things. She was quiet. She looked at the chair for a long moment, with the expression of someone who understands the distinction and is deciding what it means. I had a chair like that, she said finally, in Santa Fe. I left it there when I left. A pause. I thought about taking it. I didn't, because it was his city, not mine, and I needed to find mine. She looked at the window, at the Wyoming dark. I think this might be mine. He said nothing. He waited, because he had learned in 6 weeks that she arrived at things in her own time, and that waiting was better than pushing. I have a question, she said. Ask it. The other 5 chairs, she said, her dark eyes on him, direct and unhurried. You said the table was made for 6. If I'm at the side, she paused, and the pause was the same as the one in her job application, the thing she almost took out and didn't. Who fills the other 5? He looked at her. That, he said, is what I'm asking you. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, Wyoming held its cold and its dark and its enormous sky full of winter stars. Inside, the white oak table that had been built for 6 held 2 cups and a lamp and the particular silence of a moment that is deciding what it is. Tell me something first, she said. Anything, he said. Why did you come to meet the stage yourself? She said. Cal offered. You said no. Why? He looked at his coffee cup. I don't know, he said. She waited. I do know, he said. I just haven't said it to anyone yet. He looked up at her. Because I'd read your letter 3 times and I wanted to see for myself. What were you looking for? I don't know that either, he said, but I found it. She looked at him for a long moment. The scar above her right brow, the dark curls pinned back, the dark eyes entirely serious and entirely warm at once. Ezekiel Marsh, she said. Yes. I think the table could use some filling, she said. If you're patient about how long it takes. I built that table in 1861, he said. I'm a patient man. She looked at the table. at the 6 chairs, at Catherine's chair at the foot that hadn't moved in 8 years and wasn't going to, and at the 4 in the middle that were empty and didn't have to be, at the chair at the side that was hers now. "Then I'll stay," she said, "and we'll see." December came, and they were careful with each other in the way of people who are handling something that matters and don't want to rush it. He was a patient man. She was a precise woman. Between the two of them, they managed the thing with a care that neither announced. He came in from the range and she had coffee ready, and they talked about the cattle and the fence lines and the provisioning for January, and beneath that conversation another one moved, slower and more certain, the way water moves under ice. She learned the ranch. Not because it was her job. She cooked and managed the kitchen, and that was sufficient. But because she asked questions and paid attention to the answers, and had, within the month, a more current knowledge of the state of the north fence than Cal did. She told Ezekiel this. He told Cal. Cal was not offended, being a practical man, and began consulting her on supply questions, which she answered with the same focused competence she brought to everything. Roy, who was quieter than Cal and more observant, watched this and said nothing for 3 weeks, and then said to Cal one evening in their cabin, "She's good for him." Cal, who had been thinking the same thing since the 3rd day, just nodded. The trouble came in the 2nd week of December, from a direction that was old rather than new. His son Thomas came from Denver for Christmas early, arriving without notice on a Wednesday, which Thomas had always done. Arrived without notice, taken up space, expected the household to reorganize around him. He was 30 years old and had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness and a confidence in his own assessments that sometimes outpaced the assessments themselves. He arrived to find a woman in his father's kitchen who was not Agnes and was not any of the previous cooks he'd encountered in his occasional visits, and he formed an opinion about this immediately, which he delivered to Ezekiel that evening with the careful tone of a man who believes he is being diplomatic. "She seems very capable," Thomas said. "The meal was excellent." "Yes," Ezekiel said. "She's been here 2 months. 7 weeks. That's longer than the others." A pause. "She's quite young." "She's 31, Ezekiel said. "I'm 52. The arithmetic isn't alarming." Thomas looked at his father. "I'm not saying—" "You are," Ezekiel said, "and I understand it, but I'll tell you what I told the Reverend in Bitter Creek when he had the same conversation." He looked at his son. "Your mother was a good woman, and I loved her, and I will love her for the rest of my life. That chair at the foot of the table is not moving, but the 4 in the middle are empty, Thomas. They've been empty for 8 years. And I am 52 years old, not dead." Thomas was quiet for a long time. "Then she's not from here." "Santa Fe," Ezekiel said, "by way of Denver." "Do you know her?" 7 weeks, Ezekiel said. "I know her the way you know someone in 7 weeks, which is enough to know if you want to know more." Another silence. Thomas had his mother's eyes, and they were doing something complicated in them. "She didn't sit at Mother's chair," he said finally. "No," Ezekiel said. "She asked about it the first night, and she hasn't gone near it since." Thomas looked at the table, at the footchair, at the side chair where Nora's place had quietly become her place over 7 weeks of meals. "That's—" he stopped. "Yes," Ezekiel said. Thomas nodded once, slowly, the way Ezekiel nodded when he'd decided something. He'd given the boy that, at least. He said nothing further. He helped with the cattle the following morning with Cal and Roy, and was decent to Nora at meals, with the careful decency of a man adjusting to something he hadn't expected and is deciding to accept. By the time he left for Denver after Christmas, he shook her hand in the yard with something that was not quite warmth, but was in that direction. Agnes and Margaret came for Christmas itself, and were easier. Agnes had her father's directness, and said within the first hour that she was glad he wasn't eating cold biscuits anymore, which made Nora laugh, the first time Ezekiel had heard her laugh outright, sudden and genuine, the kind that arrives before the person decides to allow it. He stored that sound away without intending to. January came, and with it, the full severity of a Wyoming winter that had been holding back in December and had decided to stop. The temperature dropped to things that required numerical description to be believed, and the snow came in layers, one on top of another, and the work of keeping the ranch operational in those conditions was the kind that left no room for anything except the work. Ezekiel and Cal and Roy worked the cattle in rotation. Nora kept the house warm and the food hot and had, without discussion, taken on the task of keeping the account books current while Ezekiel was in the field, which she did with the precision she brought to everything and which produced, at the end of the first week, a cleaner set of January accounts than Ezekiel had managed in years. He came in one evening to find her at the table with the accounts and sat down across from her without taking off his coat and looked at the books. "These are right," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up. "I haven't balanced January in 3 years," he said. She looked up then. "I know that too," she said. "I can see it in the ledger." He looked at her, the lamp throwing gold across her face, the dark curls loosened slightly from their pin, the scar above the right brow that he'd stopped noticing and had started noticing again. A woman who balanced accounts at his table while the Wyoming winter tried the windows. "Nora," he said. She put down her pen. She looked at him with the expression she got when something important was approaching, and she was deciding how to meet it. "I've been thinking about what you said in November," he said, "about filling the table." "And?" she said. "And I think," he said carefully, "that I've been patient long enough to ask whether you've formed any conclusions." She folded her hands on the account book, the dark eyes entirely serious. "I've formed conclusions," she said. And I think," she said, "that Wyoming in January is a very long way from Santa Fe, and that I have not missed Santa Fe once since October." She paused. "And that there is a table in this house that seats 6 and has had one person at it for too long, and I am very tired of sitting at the side." He looked at her. "What are you telling me, Nora?" She held his gaze. "I'm telling you," she said, "that if you intend to ask me something, January is as good a time as any." He reached into his coat pocket. He'd put it there that morning, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided on a thing and is committing to the timing. A ring. Simple, gold, plain, the kind of thing that doesn't need to announce itself. He set it on the white oak table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "Nora Vasquez," he said, "I would like you to sit at this table for the rest of your life. Not at the side. At the end that isn't Catherine's." He paused. "I would like you to fill this house with whatever filling it takes. Accounts and provisions, and that laugh I heard at Christmas that I've been thinking about since." Another pause. "I am 52 years old, and patient, and I have a table that was built for 6. I would be grateful for your company at it." The Wyoming January pressed at the windows. The lamp burned between them on the white oak table. The 6 chairs cast shadows across the floor. She picked up the ring, looked at it, then at him. "You heard the laugh," she said. "I stored it away," he said, "without intending to." Something happened to her face then, not the almost smile he'd been seeing since October. The full thing arrived without warning, genuine and warm and entirely undefended. "Yes," she said, "Ezekiel Marsh." He put the ring on her finger across the white oak table that he'd built in 1861 for 6 people and that had been waiting, with the patience of good wood, for them to arrive. "Before I go, I want to ask you something. If you had been Nora, left with nothing in Santa Fe, building yourself back up city by city, arriving finally in a Wyoming winter at a table built for 6, would you have stayed? Or would you have needed more time? The chair at the foot that wasn't moved, the laugh that was stored away. Would you have known what those things meant? Leave your answer in the comments. I think about Nora's answer, "I'll stay and we'll see." And I think it's the bravest kind of yes there is. Not certain, just willing. They were married in February, on a Saturday, in the Bitter Creek Church. It was a Wyoming February, which meant the cold was serious, and the sky was the brilliant hard blue that follows a week of snow, and the light on everything was sharp and exact. Cal and Roy sat in the front pew together, Roy with his hat in his lap and Cal with the expression of a man whose instincts have been confirmed. Thomas came from Denver and sat beside his sisters and shook Nora's hand at the door of the church with something that had crossed the distance between careful decency and genuine warmth. Agnes cried. She had told Nora privately the week before that she had been worried, that she had expected someone wrong in a way she couldn't have named. She'd found instead a woman who balanced the January accounts and asked about Catherine's chair the first night and had been sitting at the side ever since. "Not anymore," Agnes had said, and Nora had looked at her with those dark eyes and said simply, "No." Ezekiel stood at the altar and watched her come toward him in a dress the color of deep plum, which suited her in the way that things suit people who have chosen them without consulting anyone else's opinion. He thought about a Thursday in October when she'd stepped off the stage and taken stock of everything in 30 seconds. He thought about a kitchen list written during an inspection that was still happening. He thought about November and a question about empty chairs and the most honest job application he'd ever received. He was 52 years old, and he was, without qualification or reservation, grateful. Spring came to the Marsh Ranch in April, gradual and then sudden in the way of Wyoming springs. The table seated 6 that Easter. Agnes brought her husband from Laramie. Thomas came from Denver, with a woman he was being careful about in the way that meant it was serious. Margaret came from Casper, with her 2 children, who were 5 and 3 and had opinions about everything and shared them freely. The table that had been built for 6 was, for the first time in 8 years, insufficient. Ezekiel looked at this, at the full table, the noise, the particular chaos of a house that has too many people in it, and found it was exactly what he had built the table for. The reason he'd made 6 chairs in the winter of 1861, before he'd known how many children there would be. Because it had felt right. Because some things know their own size. He looked at Nora across the table. She was cutting meat for Margaret's younger child with the focused, unshowy competence she brought to everything, talking to Thomas's woman about the provisioning in Wyoming winters, and she looked up and found him looking at her, and the dark eyes did what they did, which was receive what they found, without performance or deflection. He nodded, once, the way he nodded at things that were confirmed. She almost smiled, the bones of it, the almost that was its own kind of answer. Later, when the children were asleep and the table was cleared and Agnes and Thomas and Margaret and their various people had retired to the rooms Ezekiel had prepared, he and Nora sat at the white oak table in the kitchen lamplight, 2 cups between them, the house full and quiet at once. Catherine's chair at the foot, her chair at the other end, the 6 chairs filled. "The table's too small," she said. "I know," he said. "You'll need to build another one," she said. He looked at the table. At the wood he'd sanded 3 nights running in 1861. "I'll need a bigger plank," he said. "I'll add it to the provisions list," she said. He looked at her. "You'll add it to the provisions list," he said. "A plank of white oak." "If it goes on the list," she said, "it gets done." He looked at the lamp, at the table, at the woman who had arrived in October with a carpet bag and an honest job application and had filled the house with accounts and provisions and the laugh he'd stored away at Christmas. "Nora," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for the filling." She picked up her cup, the dark eyes warm and direct over the rim. "There's more where that came from," she said. And the Wyoming spring pressed at the windows with its warmth, and the table held, as it had always held, and the house was full of what it had been built for.